Before this video starts, if you enjoyed this video, there are many more like it already on the channel, with many more like it to come in the future, so subscribe. I am trying to hit 125,000 subscribers by the end of the year, so I would really appreciate it. I upload 6 days a week on this channel, so if you're looking for some consistent basketball talk, this is the place for it. Also, drop a like on this video. It only takes 1 second and makes a massive difference. The 2020 NBA playoffs thus far have been fucking wild. We have seen a whole bunch of upsets that we would not expect, the most recent one being the Clippers losing to the Nuggets in Game 7, and then of course we got the Bucks losing to the Miami Heat in the second round in just 5 games, and we also had the Rockets losing rather sadly to the Lakers in the second round. They were not expected to win that series, however they were expected to put up a bigger fight than they did. And I actually noticed a trend with all 3 of those losing teams for why they ended up losing the series that they lost, and that trend was they all had a very simple offensive scheme. That's what the Clippers, Bucks, and Rockets all have in common. That's why they lost. That's what the thumbnail says. Because their offense was so simple, it was easy to game plan for in the playoffs, and because they weren't used to running a complex offensive system, when that basic system was shut down, the coach didn't know how to adjust from it. Mike Budenholzer did not adjust, Mike D'Antoni did not adjust, and Doc Rivers did not adjust, because really, what were they going to adjust to? They've been running a very basic, ISO-heavy, low-skill or low-complexity offense for the entire season. The coaches couldn't adjust because this is just, there's nothing more to do. This is what they do. This is very basic, and trying to introduce a complex, or at least more complex, offensive system this late in the season is a big ask, especially in the spur of the moment in a playoff game. Let's talk about each series. Bucks versus Heat. Giannis, as much as I love the dude, has a very simple offensive game, and as a result, when he comes against a certain defense, a defense that's big, athletic, and knows how to handle him, the 2019 Raptors and the 2020 Miami Heat with Bam Adebayo and Jay Crowder, when he runs into that, he really struggles because he is easily shut down because of that simple offense. Well, I shouldn't say easily shut down, but it's not as hard as it would normally be for somebody of his skill level. So as a result, the Bucks run a pretty basic offense. It's like Giannis is very dominant inside. We have some shooters. Let Giannis be dominant and kick out to shooters. And that's basically the crux of their offensive scheme. And when the Miami Heat are shutting down Giannis, the only thing left is the open shooters, and sometimes Giannis struggles to find them, and sometimes those shooters struggle. Rockets versus Lakers. Again, Rockets, they did not have championship expectations. However, they did have expectations to at least win more than one playoff game versus the Lakers. And they certainly didn't have the expectation to collapse to the degree that they did in both Game 4 and 5. So, as a result, it's still a big disappointment that they lost to the Lakers in the fashion that they did. And as for why they lost, well, they have this small ball lineup with a whole bunch of shooting around the duo of Russell Westbrook and James Harden, and once the Lakers figured out that they could throw doubles at James Harden and still recover on shooters, and once they figured out that they could leave Russell Westbrook just completely wide open and he would be able to do nothing, once those two things were figured out, the offense had nowhere to go. Because they didn't have plays where guys were coming around screens. They didn't have cut plays. They didn't have post options. They didn't have James Harden playing off ball. They didn't have Russell Westbrook cutting off ball. They didn't have any kind of more interesting, more in-depth scheme. So as a result, when the Lakers had them figured out, it was over. As soon as they had them figured out, it was over. And it only took really one game for them to be figured out, because the Rockets killed it in Game 1 with their game plan working, but the Lakers had it understood after that, and the series was over. Clippers versus Nuggets. I think this is the most blatant example because the Clippers are the most talented team among these 3, and they face probably the worst team. And actually, I'm not even going to say probably. They face the worst team among all of these other 2 teams that lost. Like, the Heat and the Lakers are better teams than the Nuggets to me. Though the Heat aren't like miles better than the Nuggets, I also think they were a way better matchup, or a way worse matchup for the Bucks than the Nuggets were for the Clippers. That's what I'm trying to say. So there was a much bigger mismatch factor for the Bucks versus the Heat than there was for the Clippers versus the Nuggets. The Lakers have 2 star players, one of which many people, including myself, have said is the best player in the league. Now, I'm actually not as as confident just immediately saying that Kawhi is no longer the best player in the league. I still think it's pretty neck and neck between him and LeBron. But regardless of that, the guy fell apart in Game 7. And the thing is, the reason why they fell apart, again, is because they have a very, very basic offense. The crux of the offensive game plan was Kawhi and Paul George are really good at scoring. Let them be really good at scoring. And then when it wasn't Kawhi and Paul George on the floor, it was Lou Williams and Montrezl Harrell are really good at scoring. Let them be really good at scoring. And we'll put some floor spacers out there so they have room to do what they want to do, and if help defense comes, they get an open look. But that's about it. And the offense was incredibly basic as a result. It's actually rumored that the Clippers are looking for a playmaker on the trade market. Don't know how they're going to accomplish that one. If I were them, I would actually just let Montrezl Harrell go and sign Fred VanVleet, or maybe do a sign and trade for him, because apparently the Raptors are interested in Montrezl Harrell. But that's neither here nor there. Point is, basic offense. And when the Nuggets, even though they're not a great defensive team, like at least the Miami Heat as well as the Los Angeles Lakers are really good defensive teams. The Denver Nuggets are pretty good, but they're not amazing defensively. They figured out what the Clippers were doing, despite being pretty weak in the wing department. Like, it's pretty much Jeremy Grant on his own and then Torrey Craig, who can't do shit on offense. So the Nuggets, not even a good defensive team, figured out the Clippers, and they were fucked. At the end of Game 7, they missed so many shots because very rarely were they getting really good looks. They were not getting horrible looks over and over, but they were getting a lot of not great ones. Now, they also just blew the open ones, but the defense had them figured out for the most part, and as a result, offense did not come easy, and that's despite having probably the most offensively gifted team in the league, at least at the moment. And as a result of that, they collapsed because their offense was shut down. They were red, and the Nuggets took advantage of that. If you think about it, if this Clippers team had a scheme around them where they were getting guys open, they were having cutting, they had a playmaker who could distribute the ball in different ways, they had different action going off of the ball instead of it just being, all right, Kawhi ISO, all right, Paul George come around a screen, if it didn't get you open, ISO, Lou Will and Montrezl Harrell run a pick and roll. Like, that's the foundation of their offense. If they had something more in depth than that, I bet you they beat the Nuggets. And if we're actually looking at the Nuggets themselves, this series came down to offense, and the reason why that was the case was because the Nuggets have a pretty complex offensive scheme. Now, it gets a little bit less complex in the playoffs because sometimes, even though I do think it's bad to be too simple, you also do need to simplify it a little bit for the sake of easy offense. And the Nuggets' offensive scheme is a little bit less complex than in the regular season. However, they have many shooters moving around. They have action off of the ball. If you bring a double team on Nikola Jokic, the team is going to get a guy open if he wasn't open already, and Nikola Jokic is going to find him. That's another thing is for the Clippers is playmaking. I already pointed that out, but that allows for more depth, and the Nuggets had that depth to them. But even then, without that playmaking, they could have had a deeper offensive scheme. This kind of offense based around just like, hey, we have some really good players, let them do what they do. It reminds me of Kevin Durant on the Oklahoma City Thunder with Scott Brooks. I mentioned this in my last video talking about why the Clippers should fire Doc Rivers, and it was because Scott Brooks had a meme around him at the time, which was that the basic game plan for the Thunder was, I don't know, give the ball to Kevin Durant and Russell Westbrook. And that's because the offensive game plan for the Oklahoma City Thunder, at least at the baseline, was give the ball to Kevin Durant and Russell Westbrook. And if we actually take Kevin Durant over to the Golden State Warriors, look at the difference in that offensive system and look at how much that benefited Kevin Durant. Sure, his scoring per game numbers went down a little bit in Golden State, but his efficiency skyrocketed. The Warriors in general, the reason why they're so dominant really is not just because they had Steph Curry and Kevin Durant, who were two top 5 players in the league. It was because they had a ridiculous offensive scheme that got the best out of both of those guys, as well as Klay Thompson and even Draymond Green. Because Steve Kerr has an offensive system where they're focusing on getting shooters open constantly. You have, in my opinion, the 2 greatest three-point shooters of all time. Kevin Durant, who is up there on the greatest three-point shooters of all time, though he's not as high as some people say he is. And that scheme got them so many open looks. Imagine if the Warriors offense was just Kevin Durant and Steph and Klay are pretty good, let them be pretty good. It would not be nearly as dominant as it was. And even though I think Steve Kerr has some problems as a coach, one thing you can say is that he knows how to get shooters open, and the Warriors offense does that perfectly, and it's not something that's easy to adjust to in the playoffs. Looking at Kawhi again, I mentioned this in my video about him on the Toronto Raptors. The Raptors did not have a basic offensive scheme whatsoever. It wasn't the most complex in the world, but it was certainly more complex than what the Clippers did. And as a result, in the playoffs, it was not easy to defend. And if we look at the Clippers, even though on paper they have more offensive depth and more offensive talent, because Doc Rivers was not able to game plan like Nick Nurse was, it didn't matter that they had more offensive personnel. It mattered that the scheme was shit. Great offensive schemes thrive in the playoffs. Simple ISO offense with no depth just because you have superstar players will either be exposed or it just won't do as well as it did in the regular season, to say the least. At the end of the day, it's a superstars league, so you can make up for it with that, but if you can have that offensive scheme and then just further increase the impact of said superstars, you get a ridiculous offense like the Golden State Warriors had. And when you don't, you get exposed, as the Rockets, as the Bucks, and as the Los Angeles Clippers did. So that is what the 2020 NBA playoffs has taught us, if you didn't know already. I kind of already knew, but I didn't think it'd be as big of a factor as it was. So real quick before I go, again, there is a review of the movie The Devil All the Time over on my film channel. If you care to hear about that movie, it's on Netflix. I think it's pretty good. And also, I have made a Patreon, so if you care to support this content outside of just your like and subscription, which of course I appreciate, then that would be amazing. Any level of support is amazing, but if you can't support me over there are perks like a Discord server that I'm making, as well as some extra content over there, like a free 2K talk every 2 weeks that will not be on here. So go follow me on there if you're interested in supporting. But that is the end of this video. Please be sure to like and subscribe for more NBA content like this, and cue the outro music.